In PC gaming, I've always had just a love of graphics cards. I remember when I first got a Voodoo 2 and I just fell in love with the idea that this card could just produce such impressive visuals. While CPUs and motherboards and SSDs are definitely very cool, again, there's just something about the release of a new graphics card and the discussion of all the technologies which go into it just really do excite me. I feel kind of like a kid on Christmas when you've unwrapped your new games console. It really does have that air of just a special feeling for me. Not only do you get, of course, higher frame rates and better resolution with the new cards, but you get all of this new technology. To that end, I want to talk to you guys about some updates for the RTX 50 series of graphics cards, powered of course by Nvidia's Blackwell architecture. In a couple of future videos, we'll also be detailing more about Battle Mage from Intel and RDNA 4 and 5 from AMD. But in this video, well, there's some very intriguing things that I've been hearing concerning Blackwell, specifically discussing the performance targets and some updates to the specifications and some other stuff as well. To whet your appetite of what we're going to be discussing here, Blackwell will of course double down on Nvidia's commitment to ray tracing as well as path tracing, but offer as well a tangible and significant increase in rasterization performance. There's a lot of stuff to get through here, so let's just dive right into it. This is a paid partnership with BetterHelp. BetterHelp is a great way to take the first steps in taking charge of your mental health, as it offers 100% online therapy. Life can certainly toss you some curveballs, but it doesn't mean that you have to face it alone. With the right therapist, you can be given tools as well as compassionate guidance on how to deal with life's ups and downs. Therapy doesn't necessarily need to be just for a difficult situation that you're facing, such as anxiety, depression, or perhaps the loss of a loved one. Sometimes you just need someone to speak to and offer you some guidance. BetterHelp is a 100% online service, and you can just sign up and then answer just a few questions, and within a few days they will put you in touch with a 100% credentialed therapist. You can click the link in the video description or check the first pinned comment, and doing so will not only save you 10% off of your first month of therapy, but in addition to that, you would help be supporting the channel. And don't worry, if the matched therapist isn't a good fit for you, you can always change the therapist at no additional cost to you. Take charge of your mental health. Mental health issues can weigh us down, but they do not have to define us. Seek the assistance from a credentialed therapist and help heal yourself and thrive. BetterHelp offers services and expertise in specific issues such as stress, anxiety, trauma, loss of a loved one, and just general day-to-day stresses that you may have. So if you are struggling, no matter how small or trivial that the issue may seem, you can get help 100% remotely with a fully credentialed therapist. Take charge of your mental health by checking out the link in the video description or the pinned comment, which is betterhealth.com/redgaming to get 10% off your first month of therapy. So in regards to the specifications of Blackwell, I've already leaked GB202. Now, Coppertite7 Kimmy and I were going backwards and forwards about these on Twitter because I did put out a video and he was able to confirm some of the details that I leaked. And again, he and I were going backwards and forwards about those specifications, and I also put out an update, I believe, in January. But I've been given much more information now, as well as some very interesting tidbits to the architecture, but I also have some design simulation targets, release date updates, and so on. Now, I do want to stress that this is not talking about a product which is available on a store shelf, so of course stuff can certainly change. For example, we could have a clock frequency target not being achieved, or maybe Nvidia surpasses it. The specifications could certainly change, maybe concerns over cost of production, or maybe AMD are being very competitive, and that's something that Nvidia are cognizant of course. Or perhaps also there could be bugs within the testing that was being conducted, because again, this is a design simulation, so there could be a bug somewhere or another which is throwing off the results. But with that said, the source that gave me this information is generally pretty accurate. So I'll get further into the specs of the various GB200 parts in a moment, but what I want to start out with is the fact that I'm hearing low to mid 3 gigahertz is achievable with these GPUs when boosting. Now obviously that is going to differ based upon the SKU and a lot of other factors. The RTX 4090 is advertised at 2500 megahertz, but depending on a lot of different environmental factors, for example, how hot your case is, what workload is being ran, whether you have an AIB card, that can actually still be much higher than that, like, 2600, 2700, 2800 megahertz, I believe I've even seen on my GPU, and you can even get higher in some cases, particularly if you have like a custom loop, or you're willing to like crank the power limits and the fans up. You guys know how it works, so I'm not really going to tell you how GPU boost works. With that said, I do think that in a strenuous workload, I think low 3 gigahertz is very much within the realms of possibility for RTX 50. As for the performance targets, this is where things become a little more intriguing. So the bad news is the performance numbers for raster is around 60%. Now again, that number could change, and by the way, I'm referring here, I believe, is how it was told to me anyway by my source, so flagship parts versus flagship. So for example, we're comparing the highest, the largest silicon for Blackwell, which of course is GB202, versus AD102, I was about to say AD202, AD102. So again, I think 60% does make a lot of sense. We'll get, again, as I said a few times now, into the specifications more in a moment, but the SM number hasn't increased significantly. It's 192 for GB202. Much of the improvement in performance basically comes down to the higher clock frequency, architectural improvements. So what really sets Blackwell apart, as in, oh my goodness, that is very impressive, is the ray tracing performance. So I'm hearing a 2.5x increase is the performance target. Now, whether there's some jiggery pokery for Blackwell which is being employed here, or whether it's a complete apples to apples comparison, I am not 100% sure. I've also heard a 2x increase in compute, and again I would assume that that would be, for example, a 4090 versus a 5090. Now, whether or not you like it or not, or you agree with the direction, Nvidia just are doubling down, tripling down. I don't even know what level of down they are at this stage with ray tracing. They want, ray tracing to be synonymous with gaming. And whether you like that as a goal or not, it doesn't really matter. That's where the industry is heading. I think we're going to see that as well with the PlayStation 6, for example. Ray tracing is just kind of the direction that the industry is moving in. So I think that just improving the architecture, making the RT cores just more performant, enabling new technologies like, well, obviously not new anymore, but frame generation, DLSS / upscaling, ray tracing reconstruction, is all going to make this a reality in the long run. Now, let's get into the design simulation Blackwell specs. Now again, I really want to stress that these are not finalized and they can change. I'm not going to read out all of the specs because I will be here until Christmas, but you can see GB202 is going to be the flagship, 192 SM, 384-bit bus. All of these GPUs will use GDDR7, and you can see the number of GPC as well. So for example, GB202 has 16 GPC, and we have here PCIe 5x16. PCIe 5 is going to be here for a long ass time, guys. Zen 5 obviously is based on PCIe Gen 5, we know that. Same thing for Arrow Lake. My brain froze and I couldn't remember the name of Intel's next generation CPU, so that's a good sign. And I think even Zen 6 and so forth for Intel is going to be much the same. I think it's going to be a long time before PCIe Gen 6 or even DDR4 for that matter is brought into like the mainstream home consumer products. So again, that does make a lot of sense. GB203 cuts things down to 108 SM. Obviously, these products will be segmented. So GB202 would have like the 5090 and I would presume the 5080 Ti, for example, and I would assume maybe a 5090 Ti if they go that direction. And you know how product segmentation works at this point, so I don't need to kind of go in any further into that. But you'll notice as well that things are a little hinky when it comes to the GPC size, because what I'm basically being told is that GPC, at this point anyway, again, this can change, but so far it seems to come in two sizes, 12 and 8 SM. So if we look at GB202, this is pretty damn easy. Because if you look at the number of SM, which is 192, you can say, well, I take 192 and I divide that by 12, and this comes to 16 GPC. That's not complicated. However, those maths don't quite work with 12 GPC if you look at the GB207 piece of silicon. It just doesn't work. So what's going on here? Well, as you probably guessed, this is where you get kind of a different design and you get a mixed GPC approach. So that in this case would be 8 plus 8 plus 12. So obviously 8 plus 8 is 16. And then using complex maths, we can add another 12. And that obviously gives us the total of 28. Now, I really want to stress that those numbers could change, but those are what Nvidia are aiming for right now. As I just said, GDDR7. I'm having one of those days where I really can't speak. That's helpful. Is going to be used across the board. So, as far as I understand, there's no 6 or 6X parts. Strangely though, I'm told that GB207 may only be for laptops, at least initially. Maybe in the longer term there will be like a really cheap discrete part based on the 207, but that doesn't seem to be the case. 206 onwards, however, for Blackwell will be found in desktop. Now, I'm also told that the TDP for these cards is probably going up. As we saw for the RTX 4090, this changed a lot. There were a lot of rumors it was going to be like 500 watts or whatever, but obviously that turned out to not be the case for the final release version. It was like 450. But I'm hearing that the flagship could be up to 520 watts, but we'll wait and see on that. What's also really interesting is that the specifications for GB202 and 203 actually look really similar to a video I released last year. Again, as I said earlier, Coppertite 7 did confirm the 202 numbers, and basically the older slide, as you can see on screen, 192 SM, 384-bit GDDR7, they're stating that there's 36 gigabytes of memory on this specific variant. Whether or not that makes it into the final GPUs or whether they go with a smaller density variant of GDDR, I don't know. So that would be 16 GB rather than the 24 GB modules. I'm hearing that it's probably the N3E process, 96 megabytes of L2 cache. However, I've heard some mixed things on that. One source is pushing back and telling me the number isn't correct, so I do not know. And again, GB103, you can see 108 SM, 64 megabytes of L2, and the bus width has shrunk to 256-bit. All of these are monolithic dies. Speaking of monolithic, that brings me into a bit of a segue. So one of the sources who gave me a lot of this information, although it was also confirmed by a couple of other sources, they basically told me that the MCM variant for gaming was being considered for Blackwell. I won't go too much into this in this video because, again, it's cancelled, but it seemed to be that Nvidia were considering GB202 dies essentially glued together, probably with some SMs cut. Now this seems, as I said, dead for a couple of reasons. One, the pricing was just, well, let's just say really, really high. So unless you were willing to sell some body parts, you probably wouldn't really want to, pay for this thing. And Nvidia wouldn't also have had it ready on time. Plus, there just seemed to be some issues getting it to work. As I've said before, and I think most, would agree, there's a really big difference between getting a couple of GPU dies to work for compute purposes and just having it work when it comes to actually frames on screen. Now, obviously, SLI and Crossfire and that type of thing is a little different. With SLI, for example, Nvidia were, of course, releasing driver profiles, and even then there were sometimes interesting situations you could have of, like, kind of hitching or whatever with SLI. But ultimately, it did require, of course, Nvidia to release things, and also, the developers as well to kind of get in on it. And it's a lot different now with DirectX 12. and modern APIs, because, well, basically it's just a lot harder for Nvidia just to kind of do everything themselves and release like patches for this stuff. So ultimately this is not just a software solution anymore, and it requires a lot more. Well, there's just a lot more to it, basically, getting all of this stuff working for gaming, because there's also other concerns as well, like latency between the two dies. As far as I understand it, RDNA 5 is going to be the first MCM for gaming. Obviously, it was considered for RDNA 4, but the highest end SKUs are dead now for that, and those include the MCM variants. So as far as I understand, RTX 60 is now the proposed date, well, should I say the proposed architecture MCM is going to debut in for Nvidia. We'll wait and see, because it's Nvidia, so maybe they'll push it back, or there's another problem. However, silicon, or rather should I say chips, can only get so large, and at this point, if they keep making these things larger and denser, you're going to basically need to like put your PC in somewhere a little further away from you, because it's going to essentially be like a neutron star running in your PC. Obviously I'm slightly exaggerating, but my point is that you can only make a chip so big, and there's also a lot of other concerns as well, including just, well, AMD are going to be able to just basically outcompete you. So I also will add an older slide regarding some of the architectural stuff that I'd already released. This is from an older video. I think a lot of this stuff is probably correct, but obviously some of this could pertain specifically only to the data center cards. I'm not going to read out all of this stuff because, well, there's just a lot here, but I'm told that there's a new bus interconnect, which basically feeds the GPU. It hooks to the L2. This is a little bit like M3 from Apple, but there's also some unification apparently between the L0 and L1 buses. I'm also told that there might be some changes to the CUDA cores. So I'm actually getting some really conflicting information about this, because some people are telling me it's 256 cores per SM, but it's basically design dependent, i.e. the data center may get less in the gaming GPUs do not. However, another person said that they don't believe this is correct, and instead they think it's dual issue, so it could be that it's just kind of implementation dependent. I honestly do not know. I'm also told that the lowest end SKU, as I mentioned earlier, can go all the way down to, like, you know, really low bus width. I'm told 96-bit or 64-bit, but it's going to be very intriguing to see how all of that ends up being segmented. There's also improvements in frame generation technology with latency reduction. I have absolutely no idea how that works yet, just I'm told that that's what Nvidia are aiming for, but I don't know if that's going to actually come to pass or not. Of course, there's going to be improvements to ray tracing and path tracing. It seems that the Tensor cores have some additional functionality, closely resembling a lot of the rumors I was hearing regarding improvements to denoising. Also, I will mention that I've heard DLSS 4 is being worked on, and it could be some type of driver toggle. Now, how this works in reality, I don't know 100%, but of course we've seen AMD really work with driver toggles for this type of stuff as well. So I don't know how that will work. I'm going to remain a little skeptical about that, frankly. As for the release date, this is where things get quite interesting. I have one source that is insisting to me that the cards release this year, but frankly, I am very skeptical that this is the case. I think instead it's going to be 2025, with several people basically pointing to around Q2. Now, this makes things quite interesting for Nvidia because it would sandwich RTX 50 between the RDNA 4 and RDNA 5 launches. RDNA 5 seems to be at the earliest Q4 next year, so that's 2025. However, I'm actually hearing that it could be 2026. Either way, I'm sure you'll agree that that's going to be interesting because it means that Nvidia get to go first, and I'm also hearing that there's some type of refresh. Now, obviously, because RDNA 5 has MCM variants, how AMD actually segment their products will be nothing short of very interesting. The refresh for RTX 50, assuming it goes ahead, and that's again be very clear here, we're talking about not just a launch from now, but also a potential refresh of that launch, so anything can change at that point. I'm hearing that the architecture is basically going to be identical, but if this does occur, maybe we'll see upgrades to the memory speeds. Now, that obviously would perhaps mean that AMD still has quite a performance advantage, but we'll just wait and see. One of the big hopes I do have with Blackwell is that it allows more users to enjoy ray tracing and path tracing going forward, albeit, I mean, in the low to mid range of hardware. Quite frankly, a lot of folks who are running, let's say, an RTX 3060 or maybe a 4060 simply don't have those effects enabled. Do let me know if you feel differently in the comments down below, because quite frankly they are just still too expensive for the vast majority of users. If Nvidia can continue to push this boundary forward and just make ray tracing and path tracing easier, I think it would be pretty cool for the average user. With that said, it's going to be very interesting to see how Nvidia and AMD compete. I am really hearing some excellent things about RDNA 5. I'll discuss them more in a future video because quite frankly I'm still trying to clarify a couple of details specifically on the Halo SKUs, but ultimately I think things are going to be very interesting between AMD and Nvidia. Of course the two companies will be taking pretty different paths forward as you would expect, but there are also a lot of similarities. With that said, I am actually very excited to see what the future of PC gaming shall bring, and given the fact that of course we know that the PlayStation 6 is definitely going to be coming, again as I've mentioned in several videos at this point, it looks like 2028 is going to be the target, with Sony really pushing ray tracing and path tracing as well. I think by that point it's going to be, I wouldn't say in every single game that is ray tracing, but I think the vast majority of titles are going to have ray tracing and path tracing, at least to some degree. At this point, it's still very early, of course, so I do suspect that there are still a lot of users who haven't enjoyed ray tracing, especially on the PC, but I think things are going to be changing a lot. With that said, guys, take care of yourselves, have an amazing day. Bye for now.